The evening settled into the city like a gentle exhale. The faintest hints of lavender and myrrh hung in the air as braziers were lit along the narrow stone streets, their soft orange glows flickering like whispered stories told in firelight. From their small home nestled within the quieter quarters of Athens, Callistrate and Lysandros stood at the window, watching the city transition once more. Even from within, the soundscape of twilight drifted in softly, the chirp of cicadas beneath, the olive trees, the quiet footsteps of neighbors returning home, the creak of wooden shutters being drawn closed with care. Athens did not rush into nightfall. It welcomed it like an old friend. They moved around their space in silence, not out of necessity but choice, the kind of silence shared between two who no longer needed to fill the space with words. Callistrate lit a clay oil lamp, its single flame reflecting in her eyes. Lysandros placed a warm linen cloth over the small loaf of barley bread that had just finished baking, the scent of roasted grain filling the room like a memory. After a modest meal, they sat by the hearth once more, not to speak, not even to read, but simply to be. In the quiet of that space, every small sound gained meaning. The crackle of a drying log, the subtle settling of the clay walls as the night's coolness crept in, the rhythmic breathing of the cat curled at Callistrate's feet. Soon, Lysandros stood, crossed the room and opened a carved cedar chest. From within he retrieved a rolled piece of parchment. He turned to her, holding it gently, and with a faint smile said, "There's something I've not read in a while." Callistrate nodded, settling deeper into her seat. "Then tonight is the right night." He unfurled the parchment slowly, the edges crisp but softened from age. It was a collection of thoughts, a kind of private journal, not of events, but of quiet moments and reflections, not history, but the soft music of memory. He began to read aloud, his voice no louder than the rustle of the evening wind beyond the walls. There are evenings when the city feels like a sleeping giant, ancient and still breathing. I walk through its bones, through streets shaped by time, and I feel small but held, not by people, not by voices, but by something deeper, perhaps memory itself. There's peace in knowing that I am not the beginning nor the end, but only a moment passing through. Callistrate closed her eyes, listening not just to his words, but to the weight they carried. He continued, letting each phrase unfold slowly. "I once asked an old man how he stayed so calm amidst the loudness of the world. He smiled and said, 'Because I learned that everything loud eventually fades, but what's quiet, it echoes longer.' The room seemed to hold its breath. And so I seek quiet. I seek not to be remembered with shouts, but with the softness of footsteps in morning light, with the echo of water dripping in a hidden well, with the way sunlight kisses stone." When he finished, there was no applause, no comment. Only the soft sigh of the lamp, the settled warmth of stillness. Callistrate placed a hand on his, a gentle acknowledgement of the beauty he had carried in silence all this time. Later that night, they stepped outside once more, drawn to the stars. The sky above Athens had cleared fully, revealing the brilliant constellations the ancient poets had spoken of, Orion, Andromeda, Pegasus, and more. Each star seemed fixed and eternal, though they knew even these points of light moved across time's endless scroll. They walked hand in hand, following no path, no destination. Past sleeping homes, past silent columns, past flickering torchlight. The city was quieter now than ever before. The agora stood deserted, the market stalls empty, but even in stillness, it felt alive. As if the marble remembered the conversations it had once held. They paused at a marble bench beneath a tall cypress. Here Lysandros took a breath and said softly, "Do you ever wonder if time truly moves forward, or if we are only walking in a circle, brushing against echoes of the same moments?" Callistrate considered this, her eyes reflecting starlight. Maybe it does both, moves forward with our footsteps, but leaves behind the echoes like footprints. Maybe those echoes become stories, and the stories become the soul of a place. They sat for a while in that thought, the kind of quiet musing only shared when hearts are unguarded and time feels unhurried. A small breeze moved through the streets, lifting the scent of night jasmine from a nearby courtyard. A dog barked far off, Then silence again. Eventually the couple began to return home, their steps slow, as though reluctant to end the walk. But the night, like all things, had to move forward. The lamp still flickered in their window, a beacon of warmth waiting patiently. Back within their home, they prepared for sleep. The bed was simple, woven linens, soft pillows stuffed with straw and dried lavender. They climbed beneath the covers as the last of the oil in the lamp burned low. Before the flame faded, Callistrate whispered, "Thank you for today, for the—" "Quiet." Lysandros brushed a hand along her brow, his voice barely a breath. "The quiet is always here. We only need to listen." And so, they let themselves drift. Not into sleep alone, but into a kind of waking dream, carried by the rhythm of ancient stone, by the lullaby of a city that had mastered the art of stillness. Outside, Athens remained, timeless, watching, whispering, waiting for the next soul to walk gently through her stories. Morning in Athens arrived not with haste, but with the soft easing open of the sky. The first golden threads of sunlight stitched their way across the Acropolis, weaving quiet warmth into the city's waking breath. As the light crept down over rooftops, temples, and humble stone homes, it painted everything it touched with a golden stillness, as though the world itself had paused to reflect. Inside their home, Callistrate stirred before the full dawn. The air still held the chill of night, so she wrapped a thin shawl around her shoulders and moved quietly, not wanting to wake Lysandros. The hearth's embers glowed faintly, a red-orange heart pulsing beneath a soft layer of ash. She knelt before it and gently coaxed it back to life, feeding it dried olive twigs until the flames curled upward again like sleepy fingers stretching. There was peace in these moments, the kind that could only be found when the rest of the world still slept. She poured water into a small clay pot, added dried chamomile flowers, and placed it near the fire to warm. The scent rose gradually, filling the room with its soothing perfume. Outside, birds began their first tentative songs. Lysandros awoke. Shortly after, his first breath deep and calm, eyes adjusting to the soft glow of the rekindled hearth. He rose slowly, joining her beside the fire without words. Their movements around each other were familiar and unhurried, like a well-practiced dance that needed no music. Together, they shared the warm tea, the earthy flavor grounding them as the day began to unfold. There was no rush to their plans, only the gentle knowledge that the day would be shaped not by obligation, but by curiosity. After the sun had risen fully, casting long beams of amber light across the floor, they prepared to step out into the city once more. Callistrate tucked a small cloth pouch beneath her sash. Inside were a few dried herbs she hoped to trade at the market. Lysandros brought a rolled parchment and a small stylus, always ready to capture some fleeting moment or observation. The agora was slowly awakening. Merchants arranged their goods with careful precision, ceramics, wool, olives, scrolls, and spices, and early risers meandered between stalls in a slow, fluid rhythm. The gentle hum of voices rose into the air like mist over water. They wandered through the stalls without a set path. A potter demonstrated the shaping of a vase, his hands coated in wet clay. Nearby, a philosopher debated calmly beneath a shaded portico, his tone measured and thoughtful, drawing nods from a small cluster of students. As they passed a small table of scrolls, an elderly woman greeted them. Her hair was silver and coiled neatly, her hands worn but steady. "Looking for something new to read?" she asked gently. Lysandros smiled. "Always, but perhaps something old that feels new." The woman nodded and selected a scroll from beneath the table. "This one is not often chosen. It speaks not of war or conquest, but of stillness, of tending gardens and listening to the sky." Callistrate accepted it with quiet reverence, and they exchanged a few herbs in trade. As they walked away, Lysandros carefully unrolled the edge, reading just the first line aloud. "There is wisdom in a garden's silence. Where nothing speaks, everything grows." They found a quiet bench beneath a fig tree and read together, taking turns, letting the slow cadence of the words fill the spaces between the rustling leaves and distant footsteps. The hours passed gently, marked only by the slow shifting of shadows. In the distance, temple bells chimed noon, their soft echoes tumbling down the hillsides like falling feathers. Calistrat leaned her head against Lysandros's shoulder, her eyes fluttering closed, for a brief moment. Later they visited a friend, an older sculptor named Dorian, whose home was tucked into the hillside. He greeted them with warm eyes and hands speckled in marble dust. His workshop was a sanctuary of silence, where light filtered through high windows and danced across unfinished forms. He showed them his latest work, a statue of a young woman, gazing upward, her expression serene, one hand reaching as though to hold the wind. "She doesn't speak," he said softly. "But I imagine she listens to everything." Calistrat smiled. "Then she's wiser than most." They stayed for a while, watching as Dorian carved fine lines into the stone surface, the chisel tapping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound was hypnotic, like the beat of a quiet drum. Before leaving, Dorian offered them each a small stone carved with a symbol, one of the stars and one of a wave. "For your journey," he said. "Even still water reflects the sky." They returned to the city as the sun began its slow descent, the warmth of the day fading into the cool promise of evening. The streets were alive with soft energy. Children, playing in alleys, women gathering herbs, the smell of fresh bread rising from small hearths. As night returned once again, their home welcomed them like a well-worn cloak. The scroll was placed on a wooden shelf, the herbs hung near the window to dry, and the carved stones rested on their table like quiet blessings. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Lysandros paused to write in his own parchment once more. Callistrate watched him from the bed, her eyes half closed. "What will you write tonight?" she asked. He dipped the stylus and replied softly, "That we walked gently through time today. And it didn't walk away from us." And with that, they let the night wrap around them like a lullaby, ancient and tender, carried by the breath of a city that still listened. The stars returned that evening like old friends, familiar, patient, and unchanging. They shimmered quietly above the rooftops of Athens, each one a silver note in the vast music of the sky. The city had quieted once more, its bustling energy now faded into restful hush, as if every stone and street was exhaling into stillness. Within their small home, Calistrat and Lysandros had already settled in for the night. The window was open slightly, allowing a cool breeze to drift through, scented with fig leaves and distant sea air. The scroll they had traded for earlier now lay open between them, its parchment soft and yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, yet still, warm with meaning. They took turns reading softly, one passage at a time. The words flowed like a quiet stream, full of gentle reflections and observations. It spoke of moments, the kind that often pass unnoticed, the way sunlight filters through a grapevine, how silence gathers in corners, the pause before a smile, the breath before sleep. It was not a story in the traditional sense, but a meditation, a mirror held up to the quiet beauty of daily life. As Calistrat read, Lysandros watched her. The light from the oil lamp painted soft shadows across her face. Her voice was low, deliberate, soothing. Each word seemed to dissolve into the night, like incense smoke. When she finished a passage, she looked up and met his gaze, and they shared a long moment of silence, one that said more than words could. Eventually, they set the scroll aside. The room glowed softly with the last of the lamp's flame, and outside the city slept beneath the stars. "I wonder," Calistrat whispered, "if centuries from now, someone will walk these same streets and wonder about us." Lysandros smiled faintly. "Maybe they'll find a fragment of parchment, a piece of pottery, and imagine what our lives were like. Do you think they'll know how peaceful it could be?" she asked. "How still the nights were?" "I hope they do," he said. "But if not, perhaps the stars will remember." They lay down slowly, the blanket pulled up over them, the carved stones Dorian had given them resting beside the window. The wave and the star, motion and stillness, now softly catching the moonlight. In the days that followed, they continued their gentle rhythm. Each morning began in quiet with tea or simple bread, and sometimes olives or figs. They would walk into the city at their own pace, observing more than speaking. Every corner of Athens seemed to hum with history, not loudly, but in soft undertones, like a song that never ends. One afternoon they visited the theatre again. It was empty this time, its great semicircle of stone holding nothing but wind and echoes. They sat near the front, looking out at the stage, imagining the poets and players who had once stood there. Callistrate spoke first. "This place feels sacred somehow, not because of the gods, but because of all the stories." Lysandros nodded. "It's like the stones themselves remember every line spoken here." "Would you ever perform?" she asked, a teasing note in her voice. He chuckled. "Only if the role was one of silence." They both laughed quietly, and the theatre held their laughter gently, letting it drift upward with the wind. Another day they wandered into a part of the city they rarely visited, where the workshops of weavers, tanners, and metalworkers stood in low rows. The smell was stronger here, the sounds sharper, but still there was a beauty to it, the way threads danced on looms, how hot metal hissed in water. A weaver showed them how a simple pattern could tell a story, and they watched as a length of fabric took shape, one row at a time, like the slow unfolding of thought. In the evening, they walked along the outer edge of the city, where the land sloped downward, and olive groves stretched out like a sea of silver-green leaves. There the wind was stronger but gentler in its song, and the ground felt older, quieter. They paused beneath a tall olive tree, its trunk twisted with age. "This tree might have stood here since our grandparents were children," Lysandros said, placing a hand on its bark. "Maybe longer," Callistrate whispered, resting her forehead against the rough surface. "I wonder how many people have stood here just like this, breathing and listening." They sat beneath the tree as the sun dipped low, golden light spilling across the landscape like melted honey. Callistrate leaned into Lysandros, her eyes half-lidded with calm. "I wish we could stay in this moment forever," she murmured. "We are," he replied gently. "Right now we are." And as twilight deepened into night, the world around them softened once more. The stars began their ascent, one by one, just as they had countless nights before. And the city of Athens, so full of life and thought and quiet beauty, continued to cradle their every step, their every breath, in a story that unfolded without urgency, only depth as the night deepened and Athens lay blanketed in the hush of sleep. The city's subtle pulse continued beneath the silence. Distant lyres played softly from a corner home, their notes drifting over rooftops and into the cool air. The soft murmurs of night creatures blended with the rustling of olive branches, forming a lullaby known only to those who listened closely. Lysandros rose quietly, careful not to wake Callistrate, who had fallen into sleep with a scroll still resting beside her. The oil lamp flickered faintly, casting elongated shadows on the walls, dancing slowly like spirits at rest. He stepped toward the window and leaned against its frame, gazing out at the moonlit city below. The Acropolis shimmered faintly in the distance, its marble surfaces touched by silver. The Parthenon stood like a patient guardian, watching the passage of time with neither urgency nor concern. It seemed in that moment as if the stones themselves breathed, old wise breaths drawn from centuries of stories, philosophies, dreams, and quiet reverence. Lysandros closed his eyes, and in the silence memories surfaced gently. The first evening he had arrived in Athens, unsure of where to go, the market with its colors and shouts, the calm wisdom in Callistrate's eyes, the rhythm of the streets, the slow unraveling of days filled with simple, lasting meaning. He had never expected to find such peace here, yet now it seemed as though this life had always waited for him. Behind him, Callistrate stirred. Her voice was low, almost inaudible. "Couldn't sleep?" He turned slightly. "The city is beautiful. At night. I didn't want to miss it." She smiled softly and rose to join him. They stood together at the window, wrapped in silence. A soft breeze stirred the hem of her robe, and she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I dreamt we were walking through Athens," she said quietly. "But it wasn't the city we know. It was older, maybe even centuries, before our time. Yet somehow it was still familiar." "Perhaps the soul of a place doesn't change," Lysandros replied. "Just the stones and names." They remained there, eyes on the glowing rooftops, until the stars began to shift slightly, westward. Eventually they returned to the bed, and the night held them gently as they drifted once again into rest. The following morning began like many others, slow, calm, unhurried. The streets had not yet filled with merchants or chatter. The city still lingered in that sacred pause between dreaming and waking. Birds sang from tiled roofs. The smell of bread wafted faintly through the alleys. Callistrate and Lysandros walked through a narrow path that led to a small hidden garden, a place they'd discovered weeks before. Few came here. It was lined with smooth stones, shaded by a canopy of vines, and at its center stood a weathered statue of a muse, her features softened by time. They sat beneath the vines and listened, not to speech, not even to the wind, but to the quiet that gathered around them like an unseen companion. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in lazy beams, dappling the ground with shifting patterns. A tiny bird landed nearby, hopping, curiously close, then fluttered off as if content with their presence. I wonder what stories this garden could tell, Callistrate mused softly. Perhaps of lovers and philosophers, Lysandros answered, or of people simply sitting, just like us, letting the world be what it is. They spent the afternoon wandering farther than usual, tracing narrow alleys that twisted like memories. The stones beneath their feet were warm from the sun, and the walls beside them held markings, some old graffiti, some faded inscriptions, tiny, imprints of lives long gone, but still faintly speaking. At one point they came upon an old man playing a reed flute outside his home. The tune he played was slow and minor, like a forgotten lullaby. They stood silently until he finished, then thanked him with small nods and kind smiles. He returned their gaze with knowing eyes, as though he understood something of their quiet journey. Toward evening, they reached a gentle rise that offered a clear view of the city, spreading outward below. From that height, Athens appeared not as buildings and streets, but as a living mosaic, its rooftops, temples, and trees arranged like brushstrokes on a canvas of gold and green. They sat and shared a modest meal of dates, bread, and soft cheese. The setting sun painted their faces in amber light, and for a long time they simply watched the day exhale into dusk. I think, Callistrate said softly, that what I'll remember most isn't the sights, but the stillness. Yes, Lysandros agreed. The way time slows here, like it knows we're listening. She reached for his hand and laced her fingers through his. Even if we never come this way again, she whispered, a part of us will always remain in this evening. And maybe, he replied, someone else will feel it one day. The quiet, the warmth, the peace. They watched as torches were lit across the city below, their flickers echoing the stars just beginning to blink into view above. And as the sky deepened from gold to indigo, the first hush of night settled over Athens once again, soft and sacred. The night returned with its familiar grace, cloaking the city in a curtain of stillness. From their vantage point on the hillside, Callistrate and Lysandros remained quiet, their hands still gently intertwined as the city began to dim. The world no longer shimmered in gold and warmth, but in silver and softness. The torches below flickered like tiny hearts, steady and alive, yet delicate in the distance. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of everything that didn't need to be said. It was the kind of silence that could only come from deep peace, the kind that formed when two souls simply existed together, side by side, without need for anything else. Eventually, Lysandros stood, brushing the dust from his robe. "Come," he said gently. "Let's walk back while the moon is still low." Callistrate rose with him. Her body moved slowly, as though she too had become part of the landscape, an olive branch, a stone, a quiet breath among many. They stepped down the hillside path, their sandals brushing the dry grass, the soft crunch beneath their feet barely disturbing the night. The streets were empty, but not lifeless. They passed doorways where the light of oil lamps glowed faintly, from inside, casting long shadows on the whitewashed walls. Somewhere far off a dog barked once, then quieted. A breeze swept through, bringing with it the salt of the sea and the faintest trace of lemon trees in bloom. They turned a corner and entered the agora, now still and open like a forgotten stage after a long play. The marble columns bathed in moonlight stood with eternal calm. Their steps echoed softly on the stones, and the city, even asleep, seemed to acknowledge their presence, not as intruders, but as part of its quiet rhythm. Callistrate stopped near one of the pillars and ran her hand along its cool surface. "How many footsteps have passed here?" she asked. "Too many to count," Lysandros answered, each one carrying its own thought, its own silence. They walked on. As they passed the steps of the stoa, they saw a young man sleeping beneath, his cloak using his satchel as a pillow. His breathing was slow and deep, his face turned upward as if even in dreams he was watching the sky. They did not disturb him. They only paused to look at him for a moment, then continued on their way, their presence as light as mist. The winding path took them past the potter's lane, where unfired vessels rested in neat rows outside shuttered workshops. Some were still, damp with the imprint of the artist's hand. The scent of clay lingered faintly in the air. "I like this part of the city," Callistrate said softly. "It feels honest." Lysandros nodded. "Things begin here, from earth and water, from touch." When they arrived home, the lamp had burned out, but the moonlight through the window was enough. They didn't light another. Instead, they sat on the edge of the low bed and looked out through the window, watching the stars. Callistrate leaned against Lysandros again, her head resting at the place where his shoulder met his neck. "Do you ever think about where the stars go during the day?" she asked sleepily. "They wait," he said, "like old friends. Always. Waiting," she smiled. "I like that." As sleep began to gather in her limbs, Callistrate spoke one last time that night. "Promise me that no matter how far we go or how much time passes, we'll remember this, I promise," he whispered. "This night, this city, this quiet, we'll carry it with us always." The room settled into silence. The wind outside hummed through the city's narrow corridors, and from the hills, an owl called softly into the darkness. Time passed without notice. Days unfolded like pages from a scroll written in quiet ink. They wandered through the city often, yet never hurried. There was always more to notice. The shape of a shadow on an old wall, the curve of a lyre's echo in a courtyard, the way strangers greeted each other with small nods, warm and wordless. They visited a modest library, where a stooped librarian let them read aging texts in a sunlit room. They learned of myths they'd never heard, and sayings that made them laugh. Callistrate discovered a short poem carved into the wooden frame of a bench, unsigned, forgotten by its author, yet beautifully haunting. She copied it onto a small parchment and read it to Lysandros one evening. "Even stone forgets the weight of time when kissed by moonlight and left to rhyme." They returned often to the quiet garden beneath the vines. There, seasons began to shift. The light changed subtly. The scent of the wind grew deeper, more earthy. A few leaves fell, dry and golden, curling as they reached the ground. The city changed in whispers, not declarations, and so did they. One night, during a light drizzle, they walked along the sea's edge. The rain was soft and warm, barely more than a mist. The shore was quiet, the waves murmuring secrets that only the stars seemed to understand. They walked barefoot in the sand, letting the tide reach their toes and recede like breath. "I don't think I've ever felt more present," Lysandros said. Callistrate smiled. "We are part of something ancient, something gentle." He turned to her and gently pressed his forehead to hers. "We're not walking through history. We are history." And there, beneath a sky washed clean by rain, with stars blinking through, gentle clouds and waves playing a lullaby on the shore, they stood wrapped in stillness, a moment carried quietly forward by time. As the waves quietly pulled away from the shoreline, leaving behind small trails of foam and seashells half buried in wet sand, Lysandros and Callistrate remained by the sea, watching the soft shimmer of the stars reflect off the water. The moon hung low and calm, not yet full, casting its gentle glow across the wide stretch of beach like a quiet guardian, watching over sleeping children. Their footprints in the sand slowly blurred with each gentle wave, like memories fading into dreams. In the stillness, Callistrate turned to look at the city behind them. Even at night, it felt alive. The marble temples and sun-bleached rooftops stood like quiet sentinels, their silhouettes faint but certain. Smoke curled from distant chimneys, and small lights blinked like fireflies in the hills. Yet from here all felt hushed, as though Athens, too, was deep in sleep and dream. "Do you think the gods dream?" she asked softly, curling her fingers into Lysandros's hand. He smiled faintly, not in amusement but in thought. "If they do," he whispered, "I imagine it would be of moments like this, of peace, of lovers walking the shore without fear, without burden, just stillness." She rested her head on his shoulder again, and they stood in silence, listening to the rhythmic hush of the sea. Behind them in the distance, the trees swayed lightly in the wind, their leaves whispering lullabies to one another. When they finally turned back toward the city, their steps were slower, more deliberate. Every motion, every breath felt meaningful, as though they were aware of the weight of each moment they were living. Back in their small home, the oil lamp flickered with a golden dance. The scent of olive oil and the faintest hint of lavender filled the air. Callistrate moved to open the window wider, letting the night breeze pass through. It brought with it a murmur of crickets and the low hum of a far-off lyre, someone playing softly, perhaps alone, perhaps for the stars. That night, they didn't speak as they lay down to rest. They simply looked at one another, eyes meeting, in quiet understanding, and then turned toward the open window where the moonlight gently touched the floor. Sleep came gently, like a slow tide rolling in, quiet and complete. The days that followed moved like petals drifting on water, slow, beautiful, undisturbed. Each morning began with the soft chirp of birds nesting along the rooftops. The sun would rise slowly, painting the whitewashed walls in hues of pale gold and blush. The marketplace came alive again, with the slow stirring of merchants setting up their wares and philosophers exchanging pleasantries before their debates began. Callistrate found herself drawn more and more to the gardens, the tucked-away corners of the city, where fig trees bent slightly over worn stone benches and cats stretched lazily in patches of sunlight. She often brought a scroll or a bit of thread work, sitting quietly while the world moved slowly around her. Sometimes elderly women would join her, offering bits of fruit or shared stories from their younger days. Their voices were soft, their laughter even softer, like wind playing with silk. They spoke of love that had passed and love that remained, of children grown, of dreams chased and let go. But always there was peace in their words. Lysandros spent his hours listening to conversations in the agora, to the rhythm of chisels at the stonemason's yard, to the faint ring of bells from the harbor. He wandered not to discover something new, but to better know what already was. On one of their walks, they came upon a quiet ceremony near the temple of Athena. No crowd, no grand speeches, just a few young men and women leaving small offerings at the steps of the temple. Sprigs of rosemary, loaves of bread, a folded ribbon tied in gold. Callistrate and Lysandros watched from a distance, holding hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. Devotion doesn't need noise. Their evenings were always the same and always different. Sometimes they would dine with strangers, sharing meals of lentils and honey cakes, figs and olives. Other nights they remained alone, speaking little but feeling much. They would sit on the flat roof of their home, wrapped in one another's presence, watching the stars drift across the sky like stories unfolding, and always they would walk. Down hidden alleys where ivy draped the stones like velvet, through the stoa, where students leaned against columns in quiet discussion, along the harbor's edge, where fishermen mended nets and offered quiet nods as they passed. Time in Athens did not rush, it drifted. It breathed. One afternoon, while walking through a small olive grove near the edge of the city, they came upon an old man sitting beneath a tree, humming a song in a voice like gravel and silk. He looked up and smiled, gesturing for them to join him. They did, settling into the grass, cool and shaded beneath the broad branches. "I've seen 100 summers," he said, "and still this city finds ways to surprise me." "Do you remember them all?" Callistrate asked. "Not all," he chuckled, "but I remember the feeling of each one. That's what stays with you. Not the days or their order, but how They felt when the wind passed over your face, or how the air smelled when figs were first ripe. They spoke with him until the shadows grew long, and when they left, he pressed a small carved stone into Callistrate's hand. "For your journey," he said. "Even stillness is a kind of travel." Later that evening, she placed the stone beside their bed. It was simple, smooth, with the faintest engraving. A spiral. She touched it gently, tracing the shape. "It's like us," she said. "Quiet, but never still." Lysandros smiled. A journey through stillness. As the stars rose again, bathing the city in their gentle watch, they laid down once more, hearts full, minds quiet. The night air moved through the window, the sound of waves barely audible in the distance, like the breath of time itself. And in that quiet, the city of Athens, ancient and eternal, held them softly. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the linen curtains, casting gentle shadows that danced across the floor. The city of Athens awoke with a yawn rather than a stir. It did not rush into its day. It eased into it like the slow roll of honey from a clay jar. Birds perched along the edges of rooftops chirped in conversation, not urgency. The scent of warm bread drifted lazily through the streets, mixing with the faint perfume of thyme and citrus that clung to the morning air. Callistrate sat by the window with a shallow bowl of warm goat's milk and barley. Her fingers gently ran over the rim of the cup, tracing the faint imperfections in the ceramic glaze. It was an old piece, passed down from someone's grandmother, perhaps. It held the soft energy of years. In her lap, a woven blanket rested, its weight comforting, its edges slightly frayed but cared for. A small cat, one of the strays that had taken to their home, stretched along the edge of the windowsill, its eyes half closed, tail flicking rhythmically. Lysandros entered quietly, a soft yawn on his lips. He moved with the relaxed gait of someone with nowhere to rush and everything to notice. His hands held a few pieces of parchment, scrolls gifted to him by a young poet they'd met in the agora the day before. He laid them gently beside her and kissed the top of her head, his breath warm and reassuring. "Another day of wonders," he murmured. She smiled softly. "Another day of quiet." They ate in companionable silence, savoring each bite, each sip, each moment of stillness. Outside, the neighborhood was slowly blooming into life. Children's laughter echoed faintly from down the street, followed by the clatter of a clay jar and a gentle scolding. The vendor near the corner had begun to sing, his voice echoing between the buildings like an old friend returning with the morning. Today they chose a different path for their walk, toward the hills west of the city, where a small grove of laurel trees overlooked the rooftops. The climb was gentle, the kind that made you appreciate each step without demanding too much of your strength. The scent of crushed leaves underfoot and the dry, clean aroma of sun-warmed stone guided their way. From the top, the view was soft and infinite. Athens lay below, her walls curved like the arms of someone at rest. The Acropolis stood proud in the center, its columns reaching skyward like ancient prayers. Beyond, the distant shimmer of the sea blinked in sunlight, a calm mirror of the heavens. They sat beneath the shade of a laurel tree, and Callistrate unrolled one of the scrolls Lysandros had brought. The poet's words were simple, tender, like secrets whispered in moonlight. Each stanza was a breath, a pause, a touch of wonder. To walk is to dream, to feel the earth sigh beneath your step, and to hear the songs that silence keeps. She read the lines aloud in a hushed tone, as if speaking to the wind, and the wind answered, rustling the leaves gently overhead, brushing against their faces like a whispering friend. Lysandros closed his eyes and leaned back against the tree. He could feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath him, steady and ancient. He imagined the generations that had sat in this very place, farmers, lovers, philosophers, children, each carried by their own thoughts, their own dreams, but always held by the same land, the same sun. As they lingered, a shepherd passed. Nearby, his small flock grazing along the hillside. He offered them a nod and a soft greeting in the old tongue, his words seasoned with age and sun. In his arms he cradled a newborn lamb, its eyes wide and unblinking, a symbol of everything gentle and new. He paused, looking at them. "You look like you've lived here your whole lives," he said with a quiet smile. Callistrate returned his smile. "Perhaps we have, or perhaps we simply belong here now." The shepherd nodded, content with that answer, and continued on his path, the sound of his staff tapping rhythmically against stone fading behind him. They remained on the hill until the sun passed its peak, warming the stones to a gentle heat. When they finally stood to leave, they did so slowly, reluctant to part with the hush of that place. Back in the city, the afternoon brought new moments to treasure. A visit to the potter's shop, where a young apprentice showed them his latest work, clay still damp with promise. The streets hummed with quiet life, merchants bartering gently, old friends leaning close to speak, a musician plucking a lyre beside a fountain where children tossed flower petals like wishes. That evening, as the sky turned to velvet and stars stitched themselves one by one into the darkening canvas, Callistrate and Lysandros prepared a simple meal. Olives, bread still warm from the hearth, a drizzle of honey and roasted figs. The table was modest, but the air was filled with the richness of gratitude. They dined slowly, talking little, letting the flavors speak, and the silence settle like silk. Later they climbed to the roof again, bringing with them a lantern and a small woven mat. They sat side by side, wrapped in a shawl, watching as the constellations revealed themselves. The stars of Orion, of Pleiades, of stories older than the stones beneath them. "Do you ever wonder," Lysandros asked, "if someone will look up at these same stars 1,000 years from now and feel what we feel?" Callistrate reached for his hand. "I hope so. I hope they find the same peace." They leaned into each other, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Below, the city breathed, soft, steady, ancient. A city not in slumber but in quiet reflection. And above, the stars continued their slow, eternal dance. And so the evening drifted into night, not with endings, but with continuations. With the quiet knowing that time, though always moving, could pause long enough for hearts to rest. In ancient Athens, on a rooftop touched by moonlight, two souls existed not in history, not in stories, but in stillness. In the softness of night, they simply were. Dawn arrived not with fanfare, but as a gentle brushstroke across the sky, hues of lavender and peach bleeding into the darkness like watercolor on parchment. The stars slowly dimmed, their watchful eyes retreating behind the morning veil. In the distance, the hills rolled in silence, cradling the city as it stirred softly beneath the warming light. Lysandros was the first to rise. He moved quietly so as not to disturb Callistrate, who lay nestled beneath the linen wrap, her breathing, even her brow relaxed. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary, the way one might admire a painting, not for its perfection, but for its peace. He stepped lightly across the stone floor and down into the atrium, where the scent of jasmine from the evening still lingered in the corners. The coals in the hearth were faintly glowing, warm like a memory. He added a few slender sticks and the fire resumed its slow life, dancing without urgency. He filled a clay cup with fresh water from the basin, the coolness refreshing, the sound of it pouring echoing softly in the stillness. The day had yet to speak its intentions. There were no loud voices, no carts rumbling, no merchants hailing passer-by. Only silence and the low rustling of leaves that trembled in the morning breeze. When Callistrate joined him, her feet bare, her hair softly tousled from sleep, she brought with her the kind of quiet that asked for no words. She sat across from him, a small smile on her lips. For a moment they were simply there, two people breathing the same morning, sharing the same soft rhythm. Their destination that day was the library. Not the grand one near the agora, where scholars debated and scribes copied scrolls under oil lamps, but a smaller, quieter one tucked within the courtyard of a former teacher's home. It was a place known only to a few, a haven for those who sought reflection more than recognition. The streets welcomed them with warmth. A few neighbors offered sleepy nods, still folding linens or sweeping thresholds. A child chased a hoop along the edge of a wall, her laughter a silver bell in the hush. A baker waved with flour-dusted fingers, his hands already shaping the day's dough. As they walked, the smell of blooming herbs wafted from window boxes, oregano, basil, mint, each plant a whisper of someone's care. Bees hummed from flower to flower, diligent but unhurried. Even the stray dogs dozed in the sun, unbothered by the stir of human feet. They arrived at the quiet library just as the sun tipped above the rooftops. Its walls were faded with age, the clay bricks warm and textured, its wooden door slightly uneven from years of expansion and swelling. A soft creak announced their entry, and within they were greeted by a hush more sacred than any temples. Shelves lined the walls, their contents worn and beloved. Scrolls bound in faded ribbon, manuscripts penned in patient script, drawings. Of constellations, anatomy, geometry, and dreams. The air smelled of old parchment and olive oil, with a faint note of lavender tucked between the pages. An elderly woman, the keeper of the library, looked up from her stool near the window. Her face was lined, her hair silver and wound into a simple knot. She did not speak, only smiled, a knowing smile, as if she had been expecting them, as if time itself had delivered them to her. Callistrate wandered toward a shelf near the back, where scrolls on philosophy and inner peace were kept. Her fingers skimmed over the parchment, selecting one with a delicate seal. Lysandros, meanwhile, settled beside a low table strewn with sketches, early maps of the stars, handwritten notes on the motion of the moon, the music of the spheres. They spent hours in quiet exploration, reading not for knowledge but for stillness. The scrolls were not demands but invitations, invitations to wonder, to drift, to imagine. They paused often, sharing lines that lingered, verses that asked to be read twice. One read, "To walk beside thought is to dance with time, each moment a step, each silence a turn." By midday they had moved outside to the courtyard garden, a space blooming with thyme, sage, and violet blossoms. The sun warmed the stone bench they shared, and the gentle gurgle of a small fountain played beside them like a lullaby. The keeper brought them figs and a small loaf of honeyed bread, saying nothing, her presence as light as the breeze that stirred. The petals. They ate slowly, savoring each flavor as if it were a message from the earth itself. The bread was soft and fragrant, the figs plump and sweet, the water cold and pure. No banquet could compare to the humility of this meal. As the shadows lengthened, they rose to leave, offering thanks not in words but in bowed heads and grateful eyes. The keeper returned to her window, her hands folding over one another as if holding a memory. Back through the city they walked, the golden light of afternoon dusting the marble and stone with gentle brilliance. They passed artists at work, a young woman sketching the silhouette of a man playing a flute, a boy carefully chiseling a marble edge under his father's guidance. These small acts of creation seemed to breathe life into the streets. They paused at a fountain, where turtles sunned themselves on warm stone and listened to the water trickle into the basin. The sound was hypnotic, like distant rainfall, or the whisper of time itself. As evening approached, they returned home, their hearts full, their minds quiet. Callistrate prepared a soothing tea of chamomile and mint, while Lysandros unrolled a blank parchment and began sketching the memory of their day, the angle of the old library's door, the pattern of tiles in the garden, the curve of the figgy leaf's shadow. They drank their tea as twilight bloomed, not rushed, not interrupted, just present. The city, too, seemed to exhale with them, its soft breath rising with the night. As stars reappeared, the sky once again stretching its velvet robe across the heavens, they sat in silence, holding each other's presence like one holds a fragile blossom, gently, reverently, and from somewhere deep within the moment came a peace that was not spoken, not defined. It simply was. The stars shone brighter as the night deepened, each twinkle reflecting softly in the still waters of the city's many basins and fountains. In the quiet home of Lysandros and Callistrate, lanterns flickered with a gentle flame, casting long, soothing shadows on the walls. The city beyond their modest courtyard had faded into a soft hush, leaving only the sounds of night birds and the rustling of olive trees whispering against the tiled roofs. Inside they sat together, in the corner of the atrium, where the stone was warm from the day's light. Between them lay a scroll they had found earlier in the library, a poetic meditation written in the voice of a traveler who had walked the known world only to discover that the greatest journey was inward. Callistrate read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying the words like petals on the wind. Though I have stood atop high cliffs and crossed deserts vast and cold, I found the quietest beauty in the heart I carried all along. Lysandros closed his eyes to the sound, letting it drift into him, wrapping around his thoughts like a soft blanket. Each word seemed to slow the breath, to deepen the silence, to widen the space between one thought and the next. When she finished reading, she rolled the scroll gently and placed it back with the others. No more words were needed. The silence between them had a language of its own. They turned in for the night, but as was often the case, sleep did not claim them immediately. The moonlight crept softly into their chamber, painting a pale ribbon across the floor. From beyond the window came the faint clink of wind chimes, crafted from old ceramic beads and bits of bronze. The sound was random yet soothing, like the language of dreams. Lysandros spoke in a murmur. Do you ever wonder what it would feel like to walk through time not with your feet, but with your heart? Callistrate smiled with closed eyes. That's what we're doing, aren't we? Every breath we take remembers something. Every thought is a step back to the beginning. Their hands found each other beneath the linen cover, fingers interlacing in the silence, and in the warmth of that moment, something subtle but profound passed between them. Not a revelation, but a soft acknowledgement, a knowing that peace did not come from stillness alone, but from the presence shared within it. In the days that followed, the rhythm of their life returned with calm precision. Mornings greeted them with golden light over whitewashed walls. The scent of baking bread floated in from the streets. The agora buzzed with gentle chatter, but never enough to disturb the quiet inside them. They visited the sculptor's workshop again, this time to observe rather than speak. The young artist, Theron, was carving a reclining figure, his hands coated in fine marble dust. He looked up and greeted them with a nod, his eyes bright with focus. They watched in silence as the figure emerged from stone, curve by curve, thought by thought. Callistrate lingered over a series of sketches pinned to the wall, shapes of birds in flight, the drapery of robes in motion, the arc of waves upon a shore. She saw in them not just studies of movement, but invitations to stillness. To look closely was to stop, and in stopping, to feel. Later they walked to the edge of the city where a small olive grove stood, largely unnoticed by passers-by. The trees were old, their trunks twisted in elegant age, their leaves catching the light like silver. They sat beneath one of the broader trees, its roots forming a natural seat. Around them, the land rolled gently toward the sea, and the distant waters shimmered like melted glass beneath the sun. There, surrounded by the quiet dignity of the trees, Callistrate opened her notebook. A simple leather-bound collection of blank pages, she began to draw. Not grand images or scenes, but the quiet things. The line of a tree branch, the space between two stones, the spiral of a snail shell they had found near the roots. Lysandros, meanwhile, lay back in the grass and watched the clouds. He traced their shapes with his mind. A dolphin leaping, a chariot racing, a sleeping lion. They changed quickly, but in their passing each held a story, short and silent, gone before it could be told. The sun was warm, but not harsh. The air smelled of thyme and salt. For a long while they did nothing but exist, and in that existence everything was present. The past, the future, the space between one breath and the next. As twilight returned once more, painting the horizon in shades of coral and rose, they made their way home. The olive grove remained behind, its secrets kept in root and bark, its whispers held in wind. That evening, they dined on barley stew and soft goat cheese, with figs as sweet as memory. They ate by lantern light, speaking little, sharing much. When the night deepened, they again found themselves in their favorite spot beneath the fig tree in the courtyard, the air scented with the soft perfume of night-blooming herbs. The stars, ever patient, blinked overhead like distant thoughts waiting to be remembered. And as sleep approached once more, Callistrate spoke softly. Perhaps this is what it means to walk through time, not to move forward or back, but to be present in every breath, to live in a way that the past welcomes you and the future already knows your name. Lysandros turned his head toward her, his smile barely visible in the moonlight. "Then we are walking well, my love." And in the deep stillness that followed, the city of Athens continued to dream, not just of glory or greatness, but of peace, of quiet evenings, of soft moments shared in the shadow of eternity. The dawn came softly, not with a fanfare of light, but with a gentle brightening of the sky, muted hues of lavender and peach stretching across the sleeping city. The silence was still whole in those early moments, broken only by the distant sound of a rooster's call and the faint rustle of morning wind among terracotta roofs. Inside their modest home, Lysandros rose first. He moved quietly so as not to wake Callistrate, her breathing slow and peaceful in the hush of the chamber. He wrapped a light linen himation over his shoulder and stepped out into the courtyard, where the air was cool and clean. The fig tree overhead held beads of dew on its leaves, and the basin near the wall mirrored the faint light of the sky, undisturbed and still. He sat at the edge of the water, watching the way it shimmered faintly, as if the pool held memories of stars. He didn't reach out or stir it. There was something sacred in its untouched calm. The moments passed without urgency. He felt neither the weight of time nor the pressure of tasks, only the fullness of being. Soon the door to the chamber creaked, slightly, and Callistrate stepped out, her hair loose over her shoulders, eyes still heavy with sleep. She smiled when she saw him, and without speaking she joined him at the edge of the basin. Together they watched the day begin. The city stirred slowly, pots clinking, sandals shuffling, the low call of a vendor preparing his stall. Even in its waking, Athens moved with a certain grace, as though it too knew how to breathe deeply and savor the dawn. That morning, instead of heading to the agora, they chose to walk the narrow alleys that twisted like vines through quieter parts of the city. The streets were lined with low homes, whose courtyards burst with jasmine and wild thyme. Children chased each other among the shade, their laughter light and distant like birdsong. They reached a quiet neighborhood where artisans worked in open workshops, chiseling wood, painting pottery, weaving fine fabrics on looms that creaked with rhythmic music. One older weaver, a woman with eyes like polished stone and hands as graceful as dancers, invited them in. Her name was Melantha. She offered them seats and poured them a cup of warm barley tea sweetened with pressed dates. The air in her workshop smelled of wool and cedar, the colors around them a wash of ochres, blues, and soft greens. As she worked, she spoke of patterns, how each shape held meaning. The spiral for eternity, the wave for change, the diamond for protection. Each was part of a silent language woven into garments, a message wrapped around the body. Callistrate listened with fascination, touching the edges of the fabric as though reading the messages with her fingertips. Melantha asked gently if they had ever tried the loom. When Callistrate nodded, she smiled and made space for her, guiding her hands gently through the motions. The rhythm was soothing. Forward, under, pull, press. A steady heartbeat woven into thread. Time itself seemed to slow with the cadence of the loom's soft creak. Lysandros watched as Callistrate found her rhythm. He thought of how life itself was a kind of weaving, moments forming patterns, patterns forming meaning. And in the quiet repetition of the loom, he felt the world once more become simple and whole. They left the workshop just as the sun reached its gentle peak. The light was not harsh, but warm, washing the stones of the city in a golden hue. The day was quiet, yet filled with tiny wonders, the scent of fresh loaves from a nearby oven, the echo of a lyre played behind a garden wall, the stillness of a cat sunbathing on the doorstep of an empty shrine. They paused at the edge of a terrace, overlooking the city's rooftops. In the distance, the Parthenon stood silent, its columns bathed in golden light. People moved below like pieces in a gentle dance, some carrying amphorae, others gathering herbs, and still others sitting quietly beneath shaded porches. There was no need to speak. Just being there, in that moment, was enough. As they turned to return home, Lysandros gently reached for Callistrate's hand. Her fingers curled around his and they walked in step. Two quiet souls in a city built on words and wisdom, finding peace not in philosophy or poetry, but in presence. That evening, they prepared a simple supper, lentils cooked with garlic and herbs, soft bread, and ripe apricots. They ate slowly, talking little, their thoughts still drifting through the memories of the day. Callistrate placed the small woven piece she had made with Melantha on the table beside them. It was imperfect, slightly uneven, but beautiful in its simplicity. As night gathered once more and the stars blinked into place, they returned to their courtyard. The fig tree's leaves danced in the breeze, and the wind chimes whispered their soft song. The basin again reflected the heavens, as though holding a piece of the infinite within its shallow depth. They sat beneath the tree, their backs resting against its trunk, their shoulders touching. The air was cool but comforting, wrapping around them like an old friend. "Every day here feels like a dream," Callistrate said quietly. Lysandros nodded. "Because we remember to live it, moment by moment." They watched the stars for a long time, letting the night unfold around them, unhurried and gentle. And far above, the moon began its climb, silent and silver, casting its light on a city still steeped in stories, in wonder and in peace. The next morning came with a soft breeze that danced through the olive branches outside their home. A chorus of sparrows sang quietly in the distance, and the golden light of dawn filtered through the thin linen curtains of their chamber. Callistrate awoke first this time, the coolness of the early air brushing gently against her skin. She lay still for a moment, simply breathing, eyes half-lidded as she listened to the gentle rustle of leaves and the faint hum of a city just beginning to wake. She rose without stirring Lysandros, wrapping herself in a shawl, and stepped outside, into the courtyard, where the familiar fig tree welcomed her with the scent of its leaves and fruit. The stone floor beneath her feet was cool and grounding. She reached up, plucking a ripe fig from the branch, and sat quietly on the low bench to enjoy the stillness. The flavors were soft and sweet, as though the tree had absorbed starlight and turned it into fruit. Not long after, Lysandros joined her, his hair tousled and his eyes warm with the quietness of waking. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply sat beside her, and they shared the fruit between them in silence. Later that morning, they wandered out into the streets once more, this time taking a different route, down toward the Elissos River, a place many overlooked in favor of more bustling parts of the city. But to them it held something special, a peace deeper than silence, a kind of wisdom folded into the rhythm of water gliding over stones. The riverbank was lined with reeds and delicate wildflowers. The scent of damp earth and sun-warmed plants surrounded them. Here and there turtles sunned themselves on flat rocks, and herons stalked the shallows with elegant patience. Callistrate knelt by the water and traced her fingers along its surface, watching the ripples spread outward in perfect circles. It reminded her of how a single moment could echo in every direction, how every breath, every glance, every gentle act carried weight. Lysandros gathered smooth stones from the bank and showed her how to skip them. His first few throws barely bounced once, sinking with a quiet plunk. But with patience he found the rhythm, wrist loose, angle low, and the stone danced across the water, 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Callistrate laughed, soft and full of delight, and tried her hand at it too. Her first throw skipped twice, and they both smiled at the small triumph. They stayed by the river for hours, letting time melt away into the rhythm of nature. At one point, an old man passed by, leading a donkey with baskets of olives strapped to its sides. He greeted them with a nod, his face lined with years, his eyes filled with kindness. Without a word, he offered them a handful of the fruit. It was bitter and sharp, but real, earthy, honest. "People here live slow," Lysandros said thoughtfully as they chewed. Callistrate nodded. "Slow and full." On the walk back, they took a detour through a quiet grove where the trees were ancient, some as old as the city itself. The bark of the olive trees was gnarled and twisted like fingers holding secrets, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. They came upon a small shrine built into the crook of 2 trees. It was simple, unadorned, and there were small offerings at its base, figs, olives, sprigs of thyme. Someone had left a small clay token with the mark of Athena carved into its face. Callistrate bent to look closer. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Do you think the gods still listen?" Lysandros asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I think they listen to silence more than words." They sat there beneath the trees, resting against the roots, the shade wrapping around them like a cloak. Birds flitted overhead, and the scent of old bark and earth grounded them. That evening, back at home, they lit a small oil lamp and sat together in the soft golden glow. They shared bread, cheese, and honey, simple but more than enough. Callistrate laid her head on Lysandros's shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair. "Today felt like a lifetime," she murmured. "And yet it passed like a dream," he replied. As the lamp flickered and cast shadows on the wall, they let the quiet settle around them once more. Outside, the city slowed with the falling night. The voices in the streets hushed, the hearths burned low. Stars blinked into the sky one by one, and in the stillness of their courtyard, beneath the fig tree and the open sky, the world paused. Not in fear or sorrow, but in reverence. In peace. There was no need for more than this. No need for grandeur, or glory or gold. Just a moment. Shared, remembered, held. The following day in Athens began not with urgency, but with a gentle unfolding, like petals opening in the warmth of morning. The city did not rush to wake. Instead, it stirred softly, as if it too cherished the unspoken poetry of dawn. Callistrate and Lysandros had no plans. That was the beauty of this time. It was a walk through history without direction, a quiet immersion into the breathing soul of an ancient world. They chose to wander toward the quieter neighborhoods nestled near the base of Mount Lycabettus, where the stone paths curved around. Modest homes and flowering vines reached over whitewashed walls. Here life was slower than in the agora or near the academy. An old woman sweeping her doorstep paused to greet them with a tired but sincere smile. She wore a simple peplos, and a cat wove its way around her ankles. Without a word, she gestured to a bowl of dried figs resting on a windowsill. They each took one and bowed with gratitude. Farther along, they found themselves at the edge of a grove, where small children played beneath cypress trees. The laughter was soft and distant, carried gently on the breeze. Callistrate sat on a low wall and watched the children for a while. How freely they ran, how fully they existed in the moment. Lysandros sat beside her, one hand resting gently over hers. They didn't speak. They simply watched, their breaths syncing with the easy rhythm of life around them. Beyond the grove was a shaded path lined with tall, whispering grasses that led to an old bathhouse, unused, quiet, and worn by time. They stepped inside to find remnants of its former beauty, faded mosaic tiles, still damp stone benches, and the scent of thyme and eucalyptus that lingered from oils once poured into warm water. The silence inside was soft and round like the echo of distant voices now long gone. Callistrate traced the pattern of dolphins on the mosaic floor, while Lysandros rested against a stone column, eyes half closed, his thoughts drifting like the clouds outside. "How many lives pass through here?" he said softly. "Leaving. Only silence behind." She looked up at him and nodded. "And yet the silence holds them, it remembers." They wandered back into the open air, the sun now higher, though still gentle in its heat. A soft breeze rustled the tall trees around them, and the call of a bird echoed high above. A narrow path veered off from the main road, leading uphill, toward a quiet viewpoint overlooking the city. Drawn by instinct more than intention, they followed it. The climb was slow, but the view that greeted them at the top felt like a secret meant only for those who took their time. From here, Athens stretched like a painting, its temples glowing white and gold, its roofs and alleys forming a patchwork of human stories, its hills standing timeless in their gentle watch. The sea glimmered faintly beyond the distant horizon, its line blurring into the sky. They sat beneath an ancient pine tree, whose roots curled like fingers into the earth. A single breeze lifted a lock of Callistrate's hair, and she smiled, leaning into Lysandros as the quiet wrapped around them like a protective cloak. As they sat, an old man approached, a shepherd, judging by his tunic and the worn staff in his hand. A few sheep lingered behind him on the hillside, munching lazily on scrub grass. He nodded in greeting and sat down a respectful distance away, resting his staff across his lap. "You two are not of this place," he said after a while, not unkindly. Lysandros smiled. "Not exactly. But you walk it like you belong." "We're trying to remember," Callistrate said softly. "Or perhaps trying not to forget." The shepherd gave a slow nod. "This land remembers everything. The stones, the wind, the trees. They all carry voices." And then he fell silent again, staring out over the city with the quiet contentment of someone who had seen many seasons come and go. Later, when the sun began to dip, casting a soft amber light across the hillsides, the shepherd stood and bowed slightly. "May the road carry you gently," he said, then turned back to his sheep and continued on his way, disappearing slowly down the other side of the hill. They remained in place for some time after, soaking in the view, the sounds, the stillness. The light shifted from gold to rose, and shadows stretched long across the city. Somewhere far below, a flute was playing, a simple tune, one note after another, slow and tender. It wove through the evening like a lullaby. As night approached, they began their descent walking slowly, as though each step was part of a larger ceremony, one honoring the city, the day, and the time they had been gifted. Back at their home, they lit the oil lamp again, and the soft glow painted their faces in golden shadow. They spoke little. There was nothing urgent to say. The silence between them was full of shared memories, of quiet discoveries, of timeless belonging. They drifted to sleep with the scent of herbs in the air and the sound of the flute still, echoing faintly through their dreams. Morning filtered gently through the linen curtains once more, as if the sun itself were tiptoeing into their home. Callistrate awoke to the scent of rosemary and warmed bread, carried faintly from a neighbor's hearth nearby. Outside, a dove cooed lazily from the rooftop, its voice calm and rhythmic, blending with the distant murmur of Athens beginning another day. She rose slowly, letting the sleep ease from her limbs like mist fading from a hillside. Her feet met the cool stone floor, grounding her once again in this place, a place that seemed suspended between memory and dream. Lysandros stirred beside her, opening his eyes with the same gentleness as the unfolding day. "Shall we visit the potter today?" he asked softly, his voice no louder than a whisper between them. She smiled. "Yes, and maybe the herb seller after that." They dressed simply, Callistrate in a soft chiton belted loosely at the waist, and Lysandros in his usual light tunic, sandals worn from walking. The city welcomed them with a warmth not only from the sun, but from the pace and rhythm of its people. It did not rush them. It merely waited. Their first stop was a small potter's workshop nestled between two narrow homes. The air was rich with the scent of wet clay and wood smoke. Inside, a middle-aged man with powdery hands shaped a vessel on a spinning wheel, his fingers steady and graceful. Each movement was deliberate, not rushed, as if time had slowed to meet his pace. He greeted them with a nod, his eyes never leaving the clay. "You look like travelers," he murmured. "In more ways than one," Callistrate replied. "Then you must take something with you," he said, gesturing toward a collection of finished pieces on a low shelf. Small cups, oil lamps, and amphorae, each one unique, bearing the fingerprint of its maker. Lysandros chose a small dark-glazed cup, its shape simple but elegant. The potter wrapped it in cloth and handed it over with a slight bow. "May it hold more than wine," he said quietly. "May it hold memory." From there they wandered slowly through the winding paths of the market. It was quieter here than in the agora, less crowded, more like a secret known only to those who paid attention. The herb seller, an older woman with hair the color of ash and a voice like rustling leaves, offered them bundles of dried lavender, mint, and oregano. "For sleep," she said, handing Callistrate the lavender. "For strength," she added, offering the mint to Lysandros. "And for remembering," she finished, pressing a small pouch of rosemary into both their hands. They thanked her and continued on, letting their feet choose the way. Eventually they arrived at a small chapel tucked into the base of a hill, where olive trees grew thick and the earth smelled of life. It wasn't grand, just a few stone, columns and a low archway, but it carried with it the weight of devotion and the quiet reverence of countless footsteps before them. They sat on the worn stone bench just outside, letting the breeze brush softly across their faces. Callistrate looked up at the trees above, their branches twisting gently in the wind like dancers moving to music only they could hear. "This place? It feels older than words," she said softly. Lysandros nodded, like it remembers the first prayers. Inside they lit a small clay lamp and placed it at the base of the altar. The flame flickered gently, casting shadows on the walls and filling the space with a warm, living glow. They didn't ask for anything. There was nothing to ask, just gratitude, for the stillness, for the city, for each other. They returned. Home in the soft light of afternoon, carrying with them the scent of herbs and clay, and the quiet weight of moments too deep to name. As evening settled, they prepared a simple meal, olives, bread, cheese, and a few figs from the tree in their courtyard. They ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were part of the story they were writing together. Later, Callistrate arranged the herbs near their bedside. The scent rose gently, calming, a lullaby made of earth and memory. She held the small cup from the potter in her hands, feeling its smooth surface, the slight imperfections that made it real. "We've gathered pieces," she whispered. Lysandros looked over, his eyes soft. "Each day, a little more." The oil lamp burned low as they drifted once again into sleep. The silence around them filled not with emptiness, but with the quiet hum of a city that remembered. A city that held their steps, their breaths, their presence, gently like a story waiting to be told again and again. And in the hush of the Athenian night, beneath stars that had watched generations rise and fall, they slept. Together, held by time. The morning came wrapped in silver clouds that drifted lazily across the pale blue sky. A cool breeze threaded through the narrow streets of Athens, carrying with it the scent of damp stone, olive wood, and a faint trace of honey from early bread vendors. Callistrate awoke before Lysandros, sitting quietly by the window with her legs folded beneath her. She watched the sky, her eyes soft, her mind calm like the surface of a still well. The city was quieter today, as if it too had decided to pause. The usual foot traffic outside their home moved slowly, sandals brushing against smooth limestone, distant voices low and unhurried. A flute played faintly from somewhere far away, its melody rising and falling like a lullaby, meant not just for children, but for the soul of the city itself. When Lysandros stirred, he did so with the ease of someone at peace. He crossed the room without a word, and joined her at the window, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulder. Neither spoke. They simply looked out at Athens, its rooftops layered in the soft morning light, temples standing like ancient guardians beneath the clouds. "Let's walk to the edge of the city today," she said after a while. He nodded. To the quiet roads. They packed only what they needed, a small water flask, a few figs, and a folded cloth in case they found a shaded spot to sit. The streets grew less crowded as they moved outward, each step drawing them further from the voices of merchants and closer to the hush of olive groves and distant hills. Past the last few homes, the stone road gave way to dusty earth, marked by the soft footprints of travelers and cartwheels. A low stone wall followed the path for a while, and on the other side grew wildflowers. Tiny bursts of yellow, purple, and blue nestled among the grass. Bees drifted lazily from one bloom to the next, their wings humming softly like a secret song. They walked in silence for some time, their footsteps crunching gently against the dry soil, their shadows stretching long in the rising light. The path curved slowly around a hillside, revealing a narrow stream bordered by reeds. A willow tree grew at its edge, its branches hanging like soft curtains that danced slightly in the breeze. They crossed the stream using the flat stones set by careful hands long ago. On the other side, beneath the willow's shade, they spread their cloth and sat down, letting the rhythm of the day settle into their bones. The only sounds were the quiet whisper of wind through leaves and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. Callistrate lay back, her eyes half closed. It feels like we've stepped outside of time, she whispered. Lysandros lay beside her, hands behind his head. Maybe we have. They stayed like that for a long while, letting the stillness wash over them. There was no need to speak. Words would only disturb the calm that had become as much a part of them as breath. Later, they wandered along the edge of the stream, following it until it disappeared into a grove of cypress trees. Nestled within the grove was a small stone ruin, perhaps once a watchtower or a shrine, now softened by time and nature. Ivy had claimed the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and wild thyme. Inside the ruin, they found a flat stone and sat facing one another. Lysandros took a smooth pebble from the ground and began to draw in the dust, a simple circle, then another and another, until they formed a spiral. "Is it a map?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "A memory." Callistrate reached for her own pebble and began to draw beside him. Shapes and lines, not symbols exactly, but impressions, things she remembered, things she loved. The pottery cup, the cypress trees, the curved streets of Athens at dusk. The drawings meant little to the world, but to them they held everything. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the grove, they stood and walked back the way they had come, their fingers intertwined and warm. The wind had stilled. Even the bees seemed to have quieted, resting in their hives as the day surrendered gently to night. By the time they reached the city's edge once more, the oil lamps had begun to flicker into life, tiny stars lining the streets, guiding footsteps, and welcoming the dark. Back home they lit their own lamp and placed the herbs from the market near its base. The scent filled the room again, lavender, rosemary and mint, a fragrance that now seemed woven into their dreams. They lay down side by side, the quiet around them deep and steady. The soft glow of the lamp danced on the walls, and the city exhaled a slow, timeless breath. "Thank you for today," Callistrate whispered. Lysandros touched her hand. "Every day with you is a gift." Sleep came like a gentle tide, pulling them into its warm embrace. And once again the stars kept watch, ancient, silent and kind. The night held them gently, and when the first soft light of dawn crept across the sky, it did so without urgency. The oil lamp had burned low, its glow now nothing but a quiet ember like a heartbeat in the hush. Outside the city was still, wrapped in a sleepy calm. Even the birds waited. Callistrate opened her eyes slowly. She could hear the gentle rustle of linen as the breeze moved through the open shutters. A subtle shift of light played across the walls, golden and warm. Beside her, Lysandros remained still, his breathing steady, his face peaceful in sleep. She watched him for a moment, marveling at how familiar and yet sacred he had become to her. She rose quietly and moved through the home, touching small objects along the way. The pottery cup, the herb bundle, a carved wooden comb. Each one carried the memory of a day, a moment, a thought that had once passed between them and had now taken root. These were not just things. They were echoes of presence. She stepped out into the courtyard. The fig tree stood tall and watchful, its broad leaves casting gentle shadows on the stone floor. She knelt by its base and brushed her hand through the soil, cool, rich, alive. The city beyond the walls whispered faintly, a cartwheel creaking, a goat bleating in the distance, the low call of a vendor just beginning his day. Soon Lysandros joined her, his tunic loose and his hair still touched by sleep. He knelt beside her, placing a fig gently in her hand. She smiled, holding it like a small gift from the earth itself. They ate together in silence, savoring the sweetness and the morning's serenity. "I want to show you something," he said after a while. He led her through the quieter lanes of Athens, along a path they hadn't yet walked together. The buildings thinned and trees returned, standing tall like green sentinels against the soft blue sky. A narrow hill rose ahead, scattered with olive trees, and crowned by a circular ruin. What had once been a temple, perhaps, now worn and softened by the centuries. They climbed slowly, taking their time, their hands brushing now and then. When they reached the summit, the city stretched out before them like a painted tapestry. The Parthenon, proud and elegant, rose in the distance, its columns kissed by light. The agora shimmered faintly below, the whispers of the marketplace, carried upward on the breeze. Callistrate drew a slow breath. "It's beautiful." Lysandros nodded. "This is where I come when I need to remember who I am, or when I need to forget." They sat among the stones, leaning back against the remains of a fallen column. Around them, bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom, and the wind moved the grasses in slow waves. He reached into a fold of his tunic and pulled out a small roll of parchment, bound with a cord. "I've been writing," he said softly. "Just fragments of what we've seen, what we've felt." She took it carefully and unrolled it. Inside were notes written in a loose, careful hand. Not just observations, but reflections. About the scent of the herb seller's stall, the warmth of sun on worn marble, the hush of twilight over the city rooftops. Her own laughter, noted as if it were music. Tears touched her eyes, not from sadness but from the fullness of being seen. "I want to remember," he said, "even after time moves on." She nodded, pressing the parchment gently to her chest. That evening back at home, they sat in their courtyard as twilight gathered. The oil lamp flickered to life once again, its warm glow pulling shadows close like a cloak. The stars above began to appear, one by one like old friends arriving at a gathering. They read from the parchment together, the words falling softly between them like petals. Then, in quiet unity, they added more, Callistrate noting the way. The sky had changed that evening, the way the fig tree seemed to bow slightly with the night breeze. Lysandros wrote about the feeling of her hand in his, the sound of her breath when she slept. Each line became part of their shared tapestry, and, before sleep came, they placed the scroll carefully in a small clay jar, sealing it not with wax but with the simple closing of a lid, not to hide it, but to preserve it, to let it rest as they would rest. In the hush that followed, they lay down once more. Their dreams carried them gently, through the quiet hills, past the slow rivers, under the ancient stars that knew every story ever told. And Athens, that timeless city of stone and song, held them in its arms for another night, together, unhurried, unforgotten.